Theresa Skorseth, and this is Can We Talk? Thank you so much for joining us. We have a couple of very special guests today. I'm going to read a little bit about them both before I point them out to you. They're right here at the table with me. Coleen Rowley is with us. She's an attorney and a former FBI special agent whose May 2002 memo to the FBI director exposed some of the agency's pre-9/11 failures. She was one of the 3 whistleblowers who was named as Person of the Year for Time magazine in 2002. In 2003, Rowley again wrote to the FBI director, questioning him and other Bush administration officials about the reliability of supposed evidence being used to justify the impending U.S. invasion of Iraq. Under sharp criticism for her comments, Rowley stepped down from her legal position to go back to being an FBI agent, a special agent. She retired from the FBI in 2004 after 24 years with the agency. Also with us this morning is Todd Pierce. Todd is an attorney and a retired U.S. Army Judge Advocate General Corps officer. He served as a military defense counsel before the military commissioners on teams representing the Guantanamo clients. Pierce remains involved with Guantanamo-related issues as counsel on a case currently before the appellate courts. We're going to hear more about that today, as well as consulting on related human rights issues. He writes as a critic of U.S. foreign and national security policy, regularly contributing to consortiumnews.com, antiwar.com, and mondovice.net and other media. He's a member of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity and Sam Adams Associates for Integrity in Intelligence. So, Coleen and Todd, I'm so happy to have you here. We've got a million questions, so let's get right to it. What is the status of the war at the moment? It's kind of become an ongoing forever war we're in now across the Middle East and even in Africa. So Coleen, perhaps you can have your thoughts first.
Well, and of course, I spoke out very quickly after 9/11 because they had failed to connect the dots, which means that they had all this intelligence to the point where the directors said that their hair was on fire. They knew so much. So many memos were written about bin Laden was going to attack. They even had a suspect in custody. There was a memo about looking at flight schools. The public knew none of this, of course, for many years. It took 2 or 3 years before the conclusion came out that actually it was a failure to share information, not only inside of agencies, but between agencies and even with the public, which brings us to today, which is an effort to share information with the public.
Right.
Because if you don't know some of these things, then you're inclined to go along with and trust, officials, military officials, government officials, who really have every reason not to tell the full truth. So we've been lulled. The situation right now is very sad and very dangerous. We have been lulled I would say overall as a country into this idea of false security, believing that war and secrecy, government secrecy, is protecting us. And actually now it's the officials say it's perpetual war. Some will say long war. I think we're into, post 9/11 wars are already 13, 14 years, no end in sight. They're actually now putting more troops back into Iraq because after all this time thinking that the Iraq war was over, now it's restarted again. And that's just one of 5 or 6 places. It's widened to the point of being called the global battlefield. Perpetual war on a global battlefield, which means that there's no legal authority. We don't even have any specific authorization on having a war on a specific country. So it's all over. And of course it results in drone assassination and all these terrible illegal war crimes that are occurring. That's the situation, extremely dangerous because the rest of the world now has reacted. Not only the terrorist element, the extremist element, which has actually increased. I hate to tell people who think we have made progress, it actually has increased. And then the other thing is many countries are very wary now of U.S. foreign policy, which actually relies on military force. So we have a large number of countries in the world that now the polls showing hatred of Americans. Very, very dangerous for American citizens.
My gosh. Todd, what are your thoughts?
Well, let me first mention that coincidentally today, when I arrived here in Little Falls, I got an email message with the opinion that the case that I represent, along with a couple of others as a team, before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, that we've won. We only had a partial victory before. The court had decided earlier that 2 of the charges that our client was convicted of under the military commissions were not war crimes. And today, or in the opinion issued today, the final conviction for conspiracy was vacated because conspiracy is not a war crime. Only conspiracy to commit aggressive war or commit genocide is a war crime. The importance of this is that, and this is what American people need to realize, is what was invented by John Yoo and a couple of other attorneys during the Bush administration was to create a system, a parallel court system outside the regular courts and outside the Constitution, where people could be charged as, suspected terrorists.
Right.
And they made up these bogus war crime offenses so that they could always have this alternative court system as an alternative to put people into, where there would be no due process, no fair trial rights, etc. So anyway, we've got a total victory in the case of our client. The dangerous part of it is, though, is that it only, and I haven't had time to read the opinion carefully, but that it would only hold that these charges were not war crimes when the Military Commissions Act was passed, but going forward, they still can be. And these are such amorphous crimes, so-called crimes, that just dissidents could be charged with perhaps giving aid to the enemy, material support for terrorism. Mm-hmm. Like one government official said 5 or 6 years ago, that even a little old lady in Switzerland who sends a $5 donation to a charity in Afghanistan or Pakistan could be charged with material support for terrorism if even a fraction of that $5 was used, to in some way or other feed somebody who may have some connection. In other words, it's the type of legal regime that the Nazis had. I know some people object to invoking the Nazis, but the fact is that the form that we've adopted is exactly identical to the legal form that the Nazis used, mm-hmm. including to target dissidents for supposed disloyalty to the Führer. And we have that now with by going back to what the government calls our domestic common law of war, which is this one period of history when we were under the unconstrained government. That was during the martial law period of the Civil War, when I won't question the merits of whether they had to do it or not, but where martial law was declared in the northern states, not the southern states, but the northern states, to suppress political dissent against the Civil War mm-hmm. of the time. So we're now invoking those cases, the government is, as precedent for what we're doing in the military commissions, which makes it incredibly dangerous to have martial law cases as legal precedent to be used against U.S. citizens today. So anyway, that was a good news, but in researching issues on this case, what it really got me into was understanding the right to know, because that's what this really went to. The client had created a video on why Al-Qaeda fights. And very quickly, I don't mean to take this question too long, but I think to understand anything, we have to understand that in 1991, Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz issued a planning guidance, defense planning guidance, that fundamentally said that we won the Cold War and now the entire world is under our military domination and subject to our rule. In other words, they basically said the Monroe Doctrine extends globally, not just to the Western Hemisphere anymore. Mm-hmm. And there's things written about it, and I've written a little bit about it myself. It wasn't carried to the extreme through the 1990s, but with 2001 in the 9/11 attack, it was brought to its logical conclusion, where we began saying that no, we can exercise jurisdiction over the entire world against anybody, even somebody just expressing dissent to U.S. foreign policy. But my point I want to make is this 1991 declaration, and the second thing that went along with it was the remaining troops, keeping U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. It came to be seen that we were setting up a system of client states, and that's why the client on the case I just referred to, Al Balou, created a video saying, here's why Al-Qaeda fights. And unless you understand that, we're not going to get to any reconciliation of terrorism, because the grievances are still going on. And that's not to blame us as a victim, but it is to point out that in any war, there's always two sides. And that's, you can go back to Clausewitz or Sun Tzu to understand that. And, the idea that we could prop up the Saudi regime for our benefit, to the detriment of the Saudi people, was fundamentally the trigger to the creation of Al-Qaeda, most of whom were Saudi Arabian citizens. And then the second part of that was, and the second and third, was the mistreatment of the Palestinians, who were still under military occupation by Israel about 60 or 70 years after the 1967 war, where they're basically kept in an open-air prison camp. And then the sanctions on Iraq that caused, according to Madeleine Albright, at least 500,000 Iraqi children dying. So we created grievances, and then those grievances have only been magnified with the Iraq War. So until we get a recognition that this isn't an irrational war, but perhaps our policy is driving it, and that's what's creating this perpetual war machine, because the more we target somebody in Pakistan or Yemen with a drone, the more enemies we make. So we have an eternal supply of enemies because
We make
our tactics are making it.
right.
So yeah, so the terror war goes on, and the fact is, the problem is we're losing. And this is what these ignoramuses don't understand. The people who trumpet this multi-generational war, or like they say, this favorite term now is perpetual war seems to be, is that we're losing. You know, and all nations lose long wars. Sun Tzu and Clausewitz would generally point out. And it's not in their interest. We're creating a situation that's unsustainable, and ISIS is growing. They're the beneficiary of it, and it's to the detriment of democracy in the United States and constitutional rights.
Why is there not more outrage about this generation's war? When Vietnam was on the television every night at supper time, and we all got to watch it while we ate our chow mein, there was a lot of outrage. It started with the young folks, but gradually the older generation caught on and said, yeah, you're right, this is not good. Now we're in a war for 13 years. We were in Vietnam for what, 12 years? Now it's 13 years and no end in sight in the Middle East. Where's the outrage?
Well, if I can start on that.
Yeah.
So again, this idea of right to know. I mean, I began to do research. So I went back to the Vietnam War, and reading the law cases, the Ellsberg case and whatnot, and then that led me into reading the generals. And Westmoreland, did not have a realistic idea of Vietnam. His biggest accomplishment prior to going to Vietnam was getting a football stadium for West Point. That was his biggest achievement that he was proud of. But yet, because he was then put in the position of commander in Vietnam, basically before he even landed there, he was announcing to his father, there's a very good book by a former Army officer, Westmoreland, the general who lost Vietnam. And he was such a hubristic officer, really the stereotype of a martinet who believes they're infallible. So he goes over there and he says, well, all these reporters have been writing negatively, and this is 64, of Vietnam, don't know what they're talking about. You're really just waiting for the arrival of William Westmoreland, straight everything out. He never understood the nature of their war. And other military officers did, but they weren't the commanders. General Wyan said this is an unwinnable war from the very beginning. He's the one who saved Saigon during the Tet Offensive. If it hadn't been for him, Westmoreland probably would have lost the Vietnam War right in '68 because he didn't understand what was taking place. Besides that, he was concealing information by Sam Adams, a CIA analyst, because he wanted to make it appear that he was winning the war. And that's what led directly into the Tet Offensive and the almost victory by the Viet Cong during that time, because he had been concealing the fact that the Viet Cong was far stronger than he wanted the American people to know. So anyway, coming out of this, you ask, why isn't there the anger today as there was then? Coming out of there, these generals like Westmoreland, General Davidson, Admiral Sharp, who had been the head of the Vietnam War Command, they came out of there writing books that, well, we would have won, but for the media and the anti-war movement giving out real information, instead of our lies.
Right.
And so in the military, and this is very popular, General Petraeus mentions this in his Princeton dissertation that gets a phony PhD, I'd say, and in other books, all going to the same theme. So it was internalized into the military that what we have to do is control the press, we have to suppress, dissent, and that's been, in the Constitution stood in the way of some of it, but they have been able to do it indirectly in a lot of ways, such as embedded media and this constant refrain of propaganda we're getting, support the troops, etc. You got to look at that as an influence operation. It's all about creating this virtually a sacred cow in the military, so that the people wouldn't so that the people give undue deference to the military in all things,
Right.
which results in, and you could say this is really an influence operation in the military-industrial complex, because now we can see the defense budget going up constantly, even though we're not in a major confrontation with a world power, but simply doing counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, which was never considered war in the past, before 9/11. And now we're bankrupting the country and taking money away from, Social Security and other things with future cuts, etc., all to keep feeding this military-industrial complex.
I want to talk about the cost of war later, but first I'd like to hear from Coleen.
Well, what Todd has been describing is actually this excessive secrecy that is imposed. And in fact, so the truth cannot get out, and then in fact, we can substitute propaganda. We're winning, all these things that are said. The secret memo, and by the way, all of this architecture for war was set up immediately after 9/11, to the point where they even Bush suggested that we are going to attack Iraq on the day of or the day after 9/11.
Oh my
The
God.
country that had nothing to do with the attacks.
Yeah.
And again, John Yoo was one of the main writers of these secret memos. No one knew. But he goes on to start the torture, all these things. It had nothing to do with analyzing information. That was the failure. And it's sharing information.
Right.
Sharing information is the problem. It's not the things that he comes up with. But he wrote about 3 weeks after 9/11, and again, a secret memo, when a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured as long as men fight, and no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. Can you imagine if that memo had been leaked the day he wrote it, saying that we're not going to have freedom of press or freedom of speech anymore? That's what he's saying, because the need to wage war successfully, in his opinion, trumps everything. Again, this is terrible secrecy, and people then started to believe there's lots and lots of propaganda. We fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. That propaganda is extremely powerful because you think you're only killing foreigners. And of course, they're telling you they're only killing foreign terrorists and dictators like Saddam. So if you believe that, now, what we're describing in some of these costs is that the war now has migrated fully home. One of the things in the secret memos, they turned on warrantless monitoring primarily of Americans after 9/11. That secret program, which by the way wasn't just metadata, that wasn't just your call numbers that they turned on a few weeks, I think a couple of weeks after 9/11, they made a decision to begin highly illegally monitoring Americans. Okay, it was not called the so-called terrorist surveillance program. That's what Bush said when he got found out 4 years later, after the New York Times had their expose of this. I think it was 2006, 2005 or 2006, a year after he got elected. They let it be secret for the New York Times wouldn't even publish the article. But then, a year after he got reelected, they published it. Bush comes out and he says it's called the Terrorist Surveillance Program. You know what that program was called? The Presidential Surveillance Program. So he just changed the name. And of course now people believe they're not monitoring me. I have nothing to hide.
Yeah.
They're only going after the terrorists. They're only bombing people in Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia and all these places. When people believe that and they do not see that they themselves are paying the price and that they themselves are being targeted, and you have to go back historically and see that in times of war, you will always have this, whatever you call it, repression and even spying on your own domestic population. And just to give you one example, during the Vietnam War, again we're talking the comparison, it got so bad that the NSA was spying on Americans. They were targeting Americans. There's 1,500 Americans to this day. We don't even know all of their identities. But we know 2 years ago they finally released a document with 7 American names on this document that during Vietnam they were monitoring. Muhammad Ali, of course, no surprise, he was a conscientious objector. Martin Luther King Jr., who was monitored by the FBI and everyone, another civil rights leader. The New York Times editor in Washington, D.C. was on the list, Tom Wicker. The humorist for the Washington Post, Art Buchwald,
Oh my God.
was targeted. These are, again, we only know 7 of 1,500. The last 2 are the most chilling. Senators Baker and Frank Church himself were targeted. So this idea that we're somehow fighting the war on others is not true at all. It all blows back on us, to the point where you really get even your politicians who are being spied on. And of course, you know, we've had other little examples, you know, with Petraeus and other things, where their own private lives. And actually even Dianne Feinstein's computers were kind of, surreptitiously accessed by the CIA. She was outraged at the time. I mean, this is pretty incredibly. So, I mean, in a sense, there's some good news here, which is that slowly, and mostly it's kind of on the libertarian side, the freedom loving, you know, segment of the population have kind of said, you know, with Snowden disclosures, some of this war is not, as we're being told, is only to find and stop terrorists. Some of it seems directed at us.
Right.
And I think that is starting to change a little bit. In Vietnam, the major difference between Vietnam and now is there was a draft. And with that draft, people cared, because their own kids, their neighbors, everyone was going, and actually many of them being killed. The second thing, all wars tend to increase taxes. That was what Madison warned about. He said, you know, if you have a perpetual war, then you'll have to increase taxes, and people will eventually, you know, get mad about it. This war has been unusual in that they have kept taxes low, especially on the wealthy, but actually they have not increased any taxes. If they had to pay for that debt, right now it's going up to $19 trillion of national debt. If that bill came due, it would be something like $100,000 on every family in the United States. And if that happened, I can tell you there would be so much pressure to end those wars if people knew the cost that they were paying. The last one is, we've gone to this, we'll talk a lot more about this, of course, but this other idea of casualty-free, American side, casualty-free war, because it's only aerial bombing. Sometimes through drones, but other times just through this plain old bombing. And so when Americans believe, again, that our troops are not in harm's way, that it's only, and even if it's civilians, and even if some children are collateral damage, at least it's not our troops. And that's been this last thing that's gone on there, along with all of this massive propaganda machine that never tells you about the cost. They never connect the dots.
Yeah.
When they're talking about the new emergence of ISIS, for instance, as this really significant terrorist threat now in the Mideast, it can't be downplayed. They never mention how this started. And it actually starts because the United States does preemptively attacks Iraq. If Saddam had been still in place, he was an enemy of Al-Qaeda. There was no terrorist element at all in Iraq, but we opened it up. And then we also opened it up by arming these various Syrian rebel groups and etc. So now we have actually fueled the rise of ISIS. There are many articles finally coming out about that. Actually, CNN and even mainstream media is starting to write a little bit about how U.S. policies are actually helping increase terrorism. And if people know that, of course, they would withdraw their support, especially the trillions of dollars being spent.
Just one thing, so ISIS is actually beyond terrorists. I mean, there's a spectrum of conflict with terrorism being on the low end of guerrilla war. The next stage up is guerrilla war. ISIS is actually even higher than that, thanks to the United States transferring so many weapons to them by way of first the Iraqi army that ends up in ISIS's hands. And then we also know our allies, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, have all been involved with, one way or another, assisting the growth of the rebels against Syria because they want to take down Assad. And what they've done is created this huge center of chaos in the Mideast that we don't know how it's going to end up. But, so like I say, we're gone way beyond bolstering terrorism in the Mideast. We're bolstering total chaos really by conventional forces in the case of ISIS, in that they're fighting regular, organized units. So this is how far and how destructive this has all become, based upon a lot of bad decisions made in the very beginning in 2001 mostly driven by Dick Cheney's idea of unitary executive theory, which in plain English is dictatorship. He believed that the president was above all in peacetime or wartime and had no fetters upon the authority of the president. It was a hard sell before 9/11, but when they were able to make that claim that we were at war and therefore the president has to be totally unfettered, every one of John Yu's legal opinions were always including the word under the unitary executive powers of the president. All of this was about establishing the unfettered powers of a president and what they were thinking of, beyond me. Did they really think that they could keep one party's president in? But the framers understood this. And so that's why they put the Bill of Rights in. It took a lot of argument over it. It was actually added after the Constitution because people understood then immediately that, hey, there's a lot of room here for the government to go beyond its bounds. So they added in the Bill of Rights not as a luxury for American citizens for us to enjoy, unlike other citizens around the world, but rather for our means to be, as James Madison said, the sentinel over the government. And the most critical place for the citizenry to be the sentinel over the government is that area which is most costly to a nation, and that is war. Mm-hmm. Karl von Clausewitz, generally considered the premier war strategist, and he writes most of his book on war, on how to actually conduct war, much of it obsolete and irrelevant to today. But in the very first chapter, he points out that war is something you make choices of. It doesn't begin with a single stroke, but there's things behind it. That's why I say we have to understand that the United States played a big role in the Mideast long before 9/11, creating puppet states, basically, interfering with oil markets, etc. But the point being is that Clausewitz pointed out that a nation, writing this from the point of view of a statesman, is writing that a nation has to understand that sometimes you may have to get into a war, but the critical choice to make is whether or not you need to get into war, whether you want to get into war, do the costs outweigh the benefits to the nation, and finally, when to bring that war to an end. And he understood that the point of war is only short term. You go there to only achieve your nation's objectives, and then you call an end to it, because maintaining a constant state of war is destructive to the nation doing it.
Right.
And so to make those wise decisions, though, you don't turn it over to a centralized authority like the Nazis and the Soviets did for making their governmental decisions, because they're predisposed to think in only one pattern of thought.
Right.
You ask a military officer, most of them are, they've been trained to think militarily, so okay, let's go to that next hill, and then after that, another one after that. Instead, the idea, the genius of the American system was the civil authorities having precedence over the military authorities, having decision-making authority over the military, so that a broader point of view would be brought in, and that included citizenry under the First Amendment, and the other, Fourth Amendment being free from having your speech chilled by illegal actions by the government searching and surveilling you. All of that was meant to provide for the tools for the citizenry to be the sentinels over the government, particularly in war. And that's what was exercised under the Vietnam War. People began to realize, and we didn't have to rely upon the media to come and tell us, or the anti-war media. We got anecdotal evidence from the people returning from the war saying, hey, this is all mucked up. Yeah. Snafu, as they used to say in the military. Right. And gradually people began realizing hey, Westmoreland and these other generals don't know what they're doing. This is an unwinnable war. And if they had been left in their hands, as they've said in their books after, they'd have just driven this nation a downward spiral economically to where it would have been a catastrophe instead of just the calumny that it ended up being. Right. So that proved the point of the strategic value of the right to know. Because you have to know when to get into war, when not to get into war. And you can't do it, just on a whim or on an ideology like Cheney and a few others. And, I blame the Democrats as much today as they do the Republicans, because they kept this thing going. They expanded the drone war, even to include American citizens, as the Obama administration argued in federal court. Right. And I heard them make that argument. So anyway, the point is, the citizenry needs to begin realizing that any hidden costs right now, costs that have been hidden, they're going to come back. Economic costs, they cannot be hidden forever. They're going to rebound at some point, and it's our children and grandchildren that are going to pay the price. So especially young people need to get involved with this, because it's their futures that are being squandered.
Let's talk a little about the hidden costs. Coleen, you said that taxes have not gone up, and maybe that's part of what's lulled us into thinking that this is a cost-free war, but it's not. Because there are issues that are not being taken care of because the energy, manpower, money is being funneled into the Middle East. So what
Yeah,
are some
it's we're being defrauded, completely defrauded. There was an article yesterday, I believe, that the Pentagon cannot even account for $6 or $7 trillion. And this is because the way they're supposed to have been audited, an audit was actually mandated several years ago. It's never happened. Now, you can imagine if you had invested your own money in something and there was no auditor for a company, and then they told you afterwards that they're missing, billions and trillions of dollars, and you say, oh well, so what? But we're lulled into this because they just keep increasing the national debt, which covers all the sins. And again, under Bush, if you just see this trajectory of the national debt, in about 9/11, it was $5 trillion, already high, $5 trillion. It almost doubles in the Bush administration to $10 trillion. And then since then, under Obama, it's going up to $18 trillion. I mean, this thing is on a trajectory like this. A lot of economists are extremely worried because with the balance of trade and everything in the world, the United States does not even have any, its economic power has dropped relative to the rest of the world by 1/3. So we're so proud of our military might, now having all these nuclear weapons, but really, with the real true, people who know about power will always tell you economic power is more important. Well, we've lost even our economic power. And many countries in the world can say, you can't pay back this 18 trillion, some of which is borrowed from China and every place else. What does this do? This actually puts us more into relying upon nuclear weapons, etc., which makes it extremely dangerous right now, especially with vis-a-vis Russia and China. So we're not only have the opportunity costs. Of course, everybody knows about the opportunity costs. If we were spending this much money on college, on teachers, on roads, whatever, I mean, it's a fraction of the military budget that we could pay for lots of things. So, and when people say, well, these defense contractors are creating jobs, and certainly in areas where Lockheed Martin and bases, etc., are, people will have this idea, well, it's giving me a job. But the truth is, we could actually have much more economically viable industries and professions. I think you can hire 20 teachers for 1 year of a soldier in Afghanistan, for instance. So the opportunity costs are just incredible. And again, it's just a question of making this decision that we're going to invest in nuclear weapons, for instance, which will actually destroy the world many times over, which makes no sense at all and are not really serving any purpose. But that's what's going on.
And you don't need to decide, okay, well, if we had that money, we would add 20 teachers, or we'd add this or that. Those are things to be deliberated by the democratic process. And what would be the best way to use that money? It might be best not to spend it, and not be going deeper and deeper into debt. I don't know.
Right.
That's something for the democratic process. But right now, what we have, and there's a couple good books I want to refer people to right away. Lords of Secrecy is one by Scott Horton, and the other one is National Security and Double Government. Both books basically make the argument that we're no longer a democracy. We think we are, we have the appearance of one, but we have basically a double government or a deep government really exercising authority, and that's the government made up of the supposed national security, or like some people call national insecurity people, the officials, like the CIA, the NSA, the DOD, and they're really, if you think about it, what's being decided today as far as our federal budget? First we allocate, we've got to give X amount, X times 2 more to the Department of Defense, and more for the intelligence agencies, etc. And then once those monies are allocated, the crumbs left are divided up between more infrastructure, maybe more teachers, or whatever. So just by default, the budgeting of the United States is really made by this so-called second government, double government, whatever you want to call it, the deep state, first we're going to pay off the warlords in Afghanistan, then we're going to make sure that Northrop Grumman gets all the full profit they want, and on and on and on and on. And then finally, when that money is decided, they say, well, okay, we have this cap, so let's give these few crumbs left to the American domestic economy. We're losing out. We don't even have that democratic financial decision-making available to us anymore. So we've already lost that amount of democracy too, we need to realize. Just stop there for a
Well,
minute.
yeah, okay, then the question for me is, what do we do? People, I think, are just at a loss. We don't know where to go from here. We don't know how to take our country back and take our power back. So what hope is there on the horizon for us?
Well, there's no magic solution. There's no easy solution right now. They always, I think the Bible says the truth will set you free. And so the first step is the truth. You really do have to know these things. We have to demand that our mainstream media, just as Walter Cronkite finally came around in 1968, it took a long time. He had the war fever too at the start. But we have to demand that the media then begin to do its job. We have, of course, alternative media sites that you can go and see some of this. Let me just warn people, do not fall into the trap of watching these Hollywood movies. On the way here, Todd and I were talking about Charlie Wilson's War.
Oh, God.
Okay,
yeah.
so in that movie, you see that this rogue, degenerate congressman gets the Medal of Honor from the CIA for having armed the Mujahideen and the Taliban fighting the Soviet Union. Okay, so he gets the Medal of Honor from the CIA for the secret covert arming and getting them to win. And that's the end of the movie. The next chapter from that movie is 9/11. Because the people he armed were like a Frankenstein. That is what turned into Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Okay, so you have to know that. That's very important because you would not probably repeat that mistake, would you? If you knew this was going to happen. And of course, this is the problem. If Americans don't know about this covert arming of, the arming of Saudi Arabia isn't covert, but there have been covert armings even through Libya, in the bombing of Libya into Syria, etc. So that's the start. We've got to know the truth. And we've got to demand that our media, if it means that you say, I'm turning off my cable, which after when the Iraq War started, we cut our cable.
Did you?
And we actually kind of said this is why we're doing it, because it's nothing but war fever for a while. Another terrible movie, which is completely false, is Zero Dark 30. Which the CIA leaked information, actually illegally leaked information to Catherine Bigelow, the producer of that movie, making it seem like a young, red-haired, dynamic CIA agent was able to torture or was behind torturing people, and that's what gave us the information to lead to bin Laden. The truth is that woman her real name is Alfreda Bukowski. I don't think she has red hair. I don't think she's as attractive as the starlet. And in fact, she has screwed up many operations, even including the picking up of innocent people, even including she had a role in the bombing of their own CIA. They had their own CIA people lose their lives as a result of her incompetence. And she's now high level in the CIA because people saw the movie, which again was all false information. And you don't have to believe me, believe our Senate Intelligence Committee that actually said this. The leaders of the Senate Intelligence Movement walked out of Zero Dark 30 because they knew how false that was. It's an incredible situation to have this kind of a propagandistic environment. It's number one, whistleblowers are part of the answer.
Right.
So supporting Chelsea Manning, who gave the documents on a lot of the torture going on in Iraq, WikiLeaks, which now, by the way, is under a probable indictment, secret indictment in the U.S. Not only Julian Assange, by the way, but even supporters and other people around WikiLeaks have fallen under. And actually, they're not an American media. This would be like another country going after the New York Times. If you kind of understand setting bad legal precedents, can you imagine, let's say, if Germany tried to indict the New York Times for an article they didn't like? And actually, this is what's going on with our press. Our press now realizes, at least some of the people in the press realize that they're targeted. It's actually a war on journalists. They have been spied on. In the old days, we had, of course, deep throat, whistleblower, deep throat. We would never have unraveled Nixon's. Nixon was doing the exact same thing, saying he was above the law, ordering burglaries and ordering assassinations, and he got caught. And he only got caught because of a couple of whistleblowers and some very hard-hitting investigative journalism. So you've got to understand, we got to get that back.
Yeah.
Woodward and Bernstein, to be honest, should be speaking out more about this because they need to have people. We have James Risen at the New York Times, but right now there's only a handful of these kind of Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. Most of them have decided, I'll just go the easier route, take the government, press release telling me we're winning wars and we're starting new ones and etc., and I'll just transfer that into news. Or we have people like Judith Miller at the New York Times that are actually publishing disinfo, actually government disinfo. So as citizens, we've got to become better readers and we've got to really understand that it's us. I think that will change everything if people understand the costs are on us, not just on poor foreign civilians around the world.
Right.
Let me put a plug in right away for a couple of places where you can get reliable information. One is The Intercept, which was started by Glenn Greenwald. The other is antiwar.com, and another one is Consortium News. And I'd recommend all three of those as daily reading if you really want to know what's going on.
Okay, so
At least as a starting point.
antiwar.com obviously is they can look that up, they can Google that. The consortium?
Consortiumnews.com
Consortiumnews.com, okay.
and The Intercept.
The Intercept,
Just
now is that
Google
Inc. or is it
I don't recall off the top of my head,
Okay.
so but I think if you just Google The Intercept.
Google that?
But going back to Zero Dark 30, and actually let me go back a little further. Again, going back to this whole idea that the military needs to control the information that came out of the Vietnam War years. It began, as far as movie-wise, infiltrating Hollywood, you could say, with the movie Top Gun, which really began the process of turning Americans back to giving over-deference to the military. And it was intended to do that. And then Zero Dark 30 has to be seen as thoroughly an influence operation executed by the CIA, where they intended to change the perception of Americans favorably toward the CIA, favorably toward torture. Again, it was purely an influence operation, which is, now the military makes part of any military operation the information operation aspect of that. And part of that is public affairs, and how do you continuously shape the perceptions of the world, American people.
Right.
And that's what this is about. And again, you have enough people who self-censor themselves in the media, Judith Miller in particular, or who is willing to go along with the disinformation that's fed to them, that constantly keeps us into these wars. But any of the mainstream media, if you begin reading some of these other alternative news, then you can begin seeing how they consciously tilt the news itself. So we don't read about, we once told Russia that we would not move NATO up on its borders, and if you disregard 20 years of aggressive operations such as the various orange revolutions that were backed by the CIA, all with the intent of weakening, again, a nation, Russia in this case, or China in other means, under this idea that the world is now a Monroe Doctrine, and they won't allow any challenger whatsoever to hegemony by the U.S., which is widely written about by people who are enthusiastic about this idea. But when you realize that, then you realize when they point out or omit details of how the United States pushed, with Victoria Nuland overthrowing the Ukrainian government, or pivoting toward Asia, which is clearly a sign to China that we're targeting them too. So today, what we're seeing in news today I mean, is that China's now coming to see us as a genuine adversary, and so they're ramping things up as well. So it wasn't done in isolation by China. It was done in response to our own pivot toward Asia. Everything we're doing is aggressive and offensive oriented, ensure to heighten other nations' suspicions of ourselves.
Right.
And that's not in our interest.
No, it certainly is not. And we've got enough
I
of the
want
American stuff going on.
I want to bring up another cost, and it's especially pertinent to a military community, which is this, because it's all volunteer military now, it's not the draft. The one cost that is direct on military families is this increasing level of PTSD, mental disability illness, which along with that goes suicide and even homicide. And the rates now, we just had an article that came out yesterday that has a picture of a young woman who shot herself. with her gear on the front page, and it says, female veterans are committing suicide at a staggering rate. 12 times even higher than their male counterparts.
That just amazes me.
Yep, and so some of it is there's a high prevalence of rape and sexual abuse in the military itself. But there's more to it than that, because many of the suicides, and I should say homicides as well, people always think, oh well, they're all volunteer, they're being paid a lot, and if they suffer as a result of that, well, you know what, we paid them, they're all volunteer. There's a very much, I have wealthy friends that say this to themselves, because their own kids are not in the military. And they'll say, well, they were paid, so if they get, if they commit suicide, that's their problem. This is an increasingly terrible thing, and it's also homicide. In Apple Valley, where I live, in Christmas time, this family lives a mile away, 2 miles from my house, and they weren't seeing the people come out. They go in, and this veteran had shot his wife and 5-year-old daughter, and they'd already been dead for 3 weeks or something. And he actually was making a film, I think, about some of these military things. That is, and you see this over and over again. They're never, articles are not saying, whenever there's a shooting, they're not actually putting in, oh, it was a veteran who was involved in the shooting. During before 9/11, 3 of the main domestic terrorists, everybody knows, Timothy McVeigh, John Mohammed, the sniper in Washington, D.C., and there was another guy, I forget his name, who killed nurses and medical staff. He killed a bunch of people, shot them all. All 3 were returned from the first Gulf War. So actually, our main domestic terrorists before 9/11 were all veterans returned. So it's suicide and homicide. It is a form of this blowback. And people have got to understand, and families have to understand. More and more are speaking out, and I suppose it's a good sign that there is this article yesterday. Not only inside the military is this increasing suicide rate, and you know what, they say, oh well, we'll just get better doctors at the VA. I don't think this is that easy. No. Mental illness is not that easy to deal with or to so-called cure. It's not really possible, and I think that we have to really look at what's causing it to be, to start with. Right. And then that is a terrible direct cost, and we really need to do something about it.
Yeah, I absolutely.
So let me add, so as a retired military member, I've got just about 37 years combination of active duty and reserve service, over 22 years, I think, active duty. And there's 2 things I signed up. It's true that as a volunteer, I signed up to take risks on behalf of my country. And I'll admit I was very anti-totalitarian my entire life. My dad was a victim of the Bataan Death March, or was on it and got rescued. So I grew up reading and old enough when the First or Second World War was still fresh in our memories. And Nazism was on 20th century TV show every Sunday, and watched all this stuff. So I was very much anti-totalitarian and anti-communist, as the Soviet Union was totalitarian. So I signed up as a volunteer to do 2 things. One was to be willing to risk my life in defense of the country. Right. And in fact, I did go to the first Gulf War. I was there for 10 months. And but the second part of it was to defend the Constitution. That's the oath that military members take, is to defend the Constitution. So what has happened in the last 14 years is the government has repeatedly violated the Constitution in a whole lot of ways. And furthermore, they put people into the line of fire, not for the purpose of defending their country, because again, even ISIS is not threatening the United States in any way. They're not going to land on our shores. There's no ISIS Navy. It's an internal war in the Mideast. Much of the time, encouraged by the United States and other states there for illegitimate reasons. But so we would put these people, but what we're seeing as victims are not only the people that were in Fallujah, for example, the Marine infantry or whatever, but also the drone operators, because they can see on camera that in fact what they're really carrying out is something very similar to the Phoenix program during Vietnam, which wasn't about killing and assassinating the Viet Cong, but rather was about killing and assassinating the Viet Cong infrastructure. And in a guerrilla war, the infrastructure is the family members and the village leaders and others who provide the means for guerrillas to exist. And they're going to be there whether or not there's guerrillas. So when you target them, you're just callously targeting civilians.
Yeah.
But what we've done is we've invented a category of what we call unlawful enemy combatants. We just throw them all in to that category.
So
We say-
anybody's fair game.
so anybody is fair game. And, again, there's things written about it, why we need to adopt the Phoenix program by military officers, have been written a few times over the past 14 years. And if you look critically at the Phoenix, rather the drone program, I think that's what it's really about. I want to say one other thing, and here's maybe a Republican thinks, well, this doesn't concern me because the military, they never target me, I'm not a terrorist. Or the Democrats might think, well, me and the president, we're on the same page, so I would never be targeted. But again, power always shifts, and that's what the framers understood. That's why they put the Bill of Rights in, because they knew that power would be shifted between the different factions. They want to provide the means for the factions to protect themselves from other factions. So, yeah, but even under both President Obama and President Bush, counterintuitively, we've identified, both governments, both regimes, identified as potential domestic terrorists, environmentalists, and that's still being done under the Obama administration, that's different state agencies, pro-gun activists, and that was done under the Bush administration. It's a delusion to think that any of these causes that people might support and only express their support for verbally or in writing will not be targeted as potential domestic terrorists. And Netanyahu, whom I wrote an article about a couple of months ago, pointing out why the Republicans love him so much, and some Democrats, because he comes from the same authoritarian roots that some Republicans have gone back to, Leo Strauss. They love him because of the authoritarianism. Back in '96, he wrote a book saying that yes, pro-gun activists have to be targeted. We have to embed, surveillance within these ranks. We have to monitor them. Environmentalists are also potential terrorists. So anybody that is a potential dissenter to government policy was labeled by Netanyahu as a potential domestic terrorist. And that's totalitarianism at its roots. And unfortunately, our own current government and the previous one, the Bush administration, have both accepted that understanding of counterterrorism. And now we have the NSA surveilling everybody in the United States, not just a few anti-war activists or whatever. Right. And everybody runs a risk of, and here's another cost to democracy. Maybe an individual will never be surveilled, but maybe a politician that they support will be. And maybe blackmail will be used against that politician to change a vote, for example, or to boost the defense budget, or do some other thing that the so-called deep state will think that they'll benefit by. Right. So we're all losing the democratic process to the potential that this information that is being held basically in a digital dossier on every American will be used, just like any totalitarian state in the past has used it, to blackmail officials and other means.
Right.
By not following our own Constitution, which actually includes things like the Geneva Conventions, human rights law, international law, and by departing from that drastically after 9/11, not just the warrantless monitoring, but also torture. I mean, this is a complete violation. We're setting really bad precedents for the rest of the world. Drone assassination. It's what I just wrote in this op-ed, which is that we are setting a really dangerous precedent for other countries to go down to this level and use it on us. So, and also we give up our moral authority. So the only legitimate soft power that is really legitimate is that if you are, you can stand and lecture, for instance, China on human rights, and that's just fine. You know what? It's very hard for our Secretary of State, Kerry, to go over and try to lecture China on human rights right now, given our failures. So we've given up leadership in the world on moral authority. These are all extreme costs. And I think I got to talk about one solution that's coming up here. It is, a lot of these topics we're going to be discussing at the Central Minnesota Peace Fair in Brainerd. And so obviously I want everybody to keep reading all these things, but if you want to come, there will be speakers that know, including myself, including Todd and others, that are going to be speaking on these topics. And it helps to join. We don't want this to be only geared towards one element of the political spectrum. People always think, well, progressives are anti-war, but under Obama that really shifted a lot. And even I know some now that were actually for Bush's war, and they've completely changed their mind. Some main radio newscasters have done the full switch over. And now that they're realizing these costs, when we had the event that Todd spoke at with NSA whistleblower William Binney, it attracted people from across the political spectrum, because you find out conservatives, libertarians, progressives, and Greens, everyone, and independents, they agree on really 3 topics: ending the costly wars, getting back to some rule of law. Of course, we can't be perfect, but we can at least try. We can end torture. We can have some accountability for these terrible things, getting back to a rule of law and constitutional principles. And then the third one, of course, it shouldn't surprise anybody, I think a large majority of the United States is against government corruption. You think about who's for government corruption.
Yeah.
And this actually transcends party. You wouldn't know it because you get your Republicans and your Democrats, finger pointing at each other. But every ordinary person really doesn't want to have big, powerful lobbyists and Abramoffs and big money controlling elections. I don't think anybody wants that.
No.
And so the truth is, when we get together and talk, we can actually now form a coalition. If we can cut across political partisanship in this upcoming election, it's absolutely key, because everybody's going to get their favorite candidate, and you're going to bond together in your little party or whatever, and you're going to say that the other side is the enemy. The truth is, these issues, these 3 at least, and there may be some more, actually need to come through as top priority, and it doesn't matter what party or what candidate. The people need to make whoever we elect do it. As FDR said, make me do it. You should have every candidate say that they will tell the people, make me do it. And actually then, unfortunately, given the spineless nature of many politicians, and I'll put Obama in that category big time, we needed to make him do it. All the people after the elections, oh, please stop criticizing. He got the Nobel Peace Prize. Oh, well, he had to surge in Afghanistan, making all these excuses, bombing Libya. Well, he whatever. They were all making excuses for the longest time. Starting to change a little bit in the last couple of years. No, it doesn't matter the person. It doesn't matter. We all need to make whoever is elected, whether it's I hate to say Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush, we have got to get powerful as people. Exactly the same as happened during the end of the Vietnam War era. One way is to come and meet other like-minded people. You may not agree with them fully. This event had something called Blue Republicans. The Blue Republicans come out of the Ron Paul for Peace, and on these issues, they fully agree with the anti-war progressives. And so anyways, that's what I think, that's one of the solutions that we need to do.
Yeah.
We need to really get a coalition. One of our groups is called Come Home America. So that's a great idea,
Yeah.
And at the turn of the century, you did have everybody from Mark Twain and Carnegie. You had this wide range of people that were the anti-imperialists. We need something like that.
President Eisenhower, previous to that, General Eisenhower during World War II, warned Americans of the military-industrial complex in 1960. And that warning still stands, and unfortunately, it's growing far beyond Eisenhower could ever have imagined, I know. In 2008, I had been in Arlington, Virginia, being mobilized for Defense Council with Guantanamo, and I'm from central Minnesota. So when the meltdown began in 2008, in the next few years, I'm reading and talking to my family members back here and whatnot on the foreclosures and everything melting down in the economy here in Minnesota. And yet I'm standing in Arlington, Virginia. I call it the heart of the military-industrial complex and intelligence complex.
Right.
You wouldn't believe how many offices are actually seem to be just business offices that are actually, occupied by intelligence agencies or DoD agencies far beyond the Pentagon. Although now they've added a huge, basically a second Pentagon, a huge Marx building that they basically took from the city of Alexandria, even though Alexandria didn't want to give it up, the property. But in any case, the prosperity there, there's an island of prosperity amongst the sea of despair in the rest of the country, because it was the center of the military-industrial complex, and the money never stopped flowing to them. It's the five of the top 10 richest counties in the United States are right around Washington, D.C. And believe me, that wealth is not coming from lobbyists for the Health and Human Services departments or anything like that. It's coming from the lobbyists for the banking industry, the military, the military manufacturers, the contractors, and of course the military itself, which is not the contrary to what the myth is that they're all poor. No, to be an active duty military officer in that area or many other areas or a high ranking NCO, you've got a pretty good income, especially relative to most of America.
Right.
So don't be fooling yourself that we need to take up collections for the military.
Yes.
But anyway, that's the heart of it, and it's all based upon, and it's the home of the military-industrial complex. And what we need to realize is they're fighting all they can to protect themselves, and they're doing it under the cover that we're at war, even though it's them who first identified, this is where our next war will be, and they started. But we've gone on to the next step of a typical totalitarian state. And Coleen and I and the NSA whistleblowers and some others were in Berlin last January. We visited the Stasi Museum. The Stasi was a combined CIA and NSA of East Germany, as most people should know. If you really want to know about American politics today, you got to go back and study the totalitarian politics of the 80s and 70s under the East Germans and the Russians and other Pinochet to understand what's taking place today. But here's how far we've come now. And again, we stopped. I bought a book from the Stasi. The title of it was "The Dissenter is the Enemy." They weren't protecting themselves against encroachment from the West. They were protecting themselves against what they saw as the internal enemy, the dissenter. Anybody who dissented from East German policy was seen to be the enemy.
Yeah.
Well, today, just this past couple months, law reviews are very influential, especially more prominent law reviews. And the George Mason University National Security Law Review published an article, the Treason of the Professors, where they named names, targeting law professors who had dissented against the war and dissented against surveillance policies, but even, like I said, they named a couple names even, basically saying that dissenters are fifth columnists. That's identical to the belief of the fifth columnists are always those internal enemies that are accused of subverting the government on behalf of a foreign policy. It's the typical refrain target of totalitarian states. I always say there's fifth columnists, and that's why we have to be authoritarian and have a police state. This article makes the same argument by I don't know if he's a professor, but being published in a very influential law review, saying that we need to begin targeting these professors and other dissenters and have things such as military detention for them and again, putting them in front of military commissions using phony offenses such as material support for terrorism. And in fact, we already created that in law, Section 1021 of the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, that provides that those people who are suspected of aiding or being a terrorist, and again, aiding a terrorist can be construed by a prosecutor as just being anti-war. Those individuals can be put into military detention pending disposition under the law of war. And what we've now contrived to create under the military commissions is a new body that we now call our domestic common law ward. I think I already mentioned this. Those are the martial law cases of the Civil War that were repudiated immediately afterward, but now they've been resuscitated. And so indirectly, we're basically bringing in a form of martial law to identify and target dissenters today. And we haven't gone that far yet. We only have created the legal edifice for it. But it's only awaiting that president and that Congress who's willing to go far enough to use those tools against American political dissenters, even if they're right, to bring about a really genuine police state in the United States.
That's just chilling, and we could talk about this for weeks, I think, but we've run out of time. I want to, before we close, I want to again mention the Central Minnesota Peace Fair. It's in Brainerd in Lum Park, L-U-M Park Pavilion, number 2. It's from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. on the 20th of June. Oh, I hope you can come. And as Todd and Coleen both said, even if you don't think you're going to agree with us, come and tell us what you think, and we can get our heads together, stop the division that's keeping anything from happening, and target the causes that we have in common. I want to thank our guests, Coleen Rowley, Todd Pierce, thank you so much for coming up here and giving us the benefit of your experience and your wisdom. On our next show, we're going to have a couple more guests that Herb Davis is going to be here. He's been with us before. We're also going to have Jim Rothstein, and I'll tell you all about him, but he's a very important voice in the movement for transparency. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon.